Welcome again to a Train the Trainer podcast. And this time I have a conversation in English with my Dutch colleague Arne Nieuwenhuys, who lives now in New Zealand. I think, Arne, your English is now better than mine. I think
I
so.
would still hope so. I use it every day.
I hope so too. So I'm a little bit struggling sometimes with terms, which maybe you can correct me. And Dr. Nieuwenhuys worked at a university here in the Netherlands. In a great tradition, starting with Raoul Audians, Arne himself, Peter Renden, Matthijs Koedijk, Vano Hutter, Annemarie Landman. They all did the dissertation work related to police performance under pressure and so on. And you're now working in New Zealand. What is your position job now, Arne?
Right. So I work at the University of Auckland. It's in an exercise sciences department. So a lot of the work that is done within the department is to do with sports, but also with movement rehabilitation, with chronically ill, or people otherwise suffering from injury. My work, though, has stayed pretty much the same. So I'm still working around human performance and effects of anxiety, fatigue, lack of sleep on our ability to control skilled movement.
Okay, great. Well, we go into that, but before that, I had prepared some like warming up questions, so to speak. And
Sure.
and mostly I have to admit that these are very egocentric questions because I'm struggling with them myself. So I love to hear the perspective of others. And the first question is, what is the most important thing you have learned about police performance under pressure? If you had to pick something back from the days and from now, the most important thing you've learned about that.
Well, as somebody who isn't inherently sort of familiar with the work that police officers do, I'm not a police officer myself. I think the most important learning for me personally was just familiarizing through all the stories that the participants in our research came with, the extremely stressful situations that people can be confronted with, and at times also the lack of preparation. Um, yeah, that makes it really hard, really daunting, um, especially given how people rely on your sort of being able to behave in a goal-directed manner. Um, yeah, it's a lot of respect for police officers.
Yeah. Well, me too. And it's indeed what you say. Or the biggest problem seems to be the lack of training time. And that there is
Mm.
a lot of knowledge. There's a lot of
There's not a lack of will, there's a lack of time.
yeah, lack of
Absolutely.
time. Yeah. And then the second question, what is, and I know this, we didn't prepare it, this is spontaneous, of course. So what is the most misunderstood thing in police training? If you go back to your research, what is the thing,
Mm.
what is misunderstood, for example, from the research?
In public perception,
No, in
is it?
police training. So what do you think is misunderstood in police training? What do we do wrong, or
Um,
what do we
that's
miss?
a difficult question to answer, I think. But I think what is typical in police training is that, and as it is in many other professional fields, is that a lot of time simply is occupied by meeting whatever guidelines you need to adhere to, standards you need to meet by law, by regulation, which takes away from sort of the quality and really valuable time you could spend training, for instance, in more representative environments, things that aren't immediately tested in examinations, but which, and I think we'll probably come to speak about that, I think contribute or play an important role in how people potentially perform and behave in more real life situations.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. Agree. And then the third one is, and this is a question I'm really interested in. I have done it. I have to ask you. Recently, there came some research from Victoria Brazil. She is a simulation researcher, ER doctor, and our colleagues in emergency medicine. They talked about the role of emotions in simulation training and
Mm,
about the difference between stress and emotion, and that it is important. I also sent you a paper from Lisa Veldman Barrett. She's the second
yes.
author. and they suggested another framework for police decision making. Again, making a how do you call it, an argument for being more precise about what are we talking about. Are we talking about stress? Is stress the same as emotion? I know you published a lot about anxiety. Is anxiety the same as stress? So am I just, struggling with words without meaning, or do they matter?
Well, that's a great point, and good to get that. Well, perhaps not out of the way, but at least talk about it at the start of our conversation. Because yes, stress is a very broad concept, and conversationally, you can of course speak about this, but lots of different people attach different meaning to it. Like generically speaking, or perhaps even strictly speaking, it's nothing more and nothing less than just an imbalance relative to our sort of bodily homeostasis, right? Anything away from that homeostasis is potentially a stress state, and stressful circumstances, so circumstances that bring about change in our bodily states, our psychological, biological states, can trigger lots of different emotions. So no, I don't think stress is an emotion. Stress is a generic concept that, yeah, might reflect a range of emotions like anger, that and including anxiety that can arise in what we call stressful
Yeah.
circumstances. Yeah.
Yeah, because in the emotion research, especially from the work of Lisa Feldman Barrett, they talk about even another important thing that's called affect, which is not even an emotion, and this is the combination of how aroused are you, and does it feel pleasurable or not pleasurable?
Yeah.
Because being aroused, you can be high aroused, but it can be a good feeling. So yeah,
Yeah, absolutely.
and
Yeah,
you can be
excitement.
yeah, excitement versus anxiety. Both are high arousal, but they are very different things. So yeah, and because in your research you talked a lot about anxiety, isn't it?
Yeah, we talk a lot about anxiety. So I guess what might be useful in terms of coming back to is like we're looking at people who have to achieve certain goals in stressful circumstances, and they're stressful because people are dependent on the outcome, either themselves or members of the public are dependent on the outcome, and so there's an incentive to do well. Now, what is very normal in these situations where there is incentives, motivated performance situations, is that we make a little bit of an appraisal as to whether we feel capable to meet the demands that are set by that situation. And in case we feel capable, we can feel challenged, right? And that can be an exciting feeling, right? It can be a positive thing because now we can demonstrate what we practiced. But in situations where, for whatever reason, either because consequences are so huge that we start to doubt, or what we need to do is so difficult and impossible, given whatever constraints are present, if we perceive ourselves incapable or potentially not capable of solving that situation to good effect,
Yeah,
that is when we start to feel anxious.
yeah,
Yeah. And
that
this anxiety, just like how positive emotions and challenging situations can bring about positive effects, this anxiety that emerges if we perceive ourselves incapable or potentially not capable of bringing the situation to a good end, that can really dramatically affect
yeah,
how well we perform, and even relative to what we're used to in terms of when we practice skills in a more secure environment, we might be very capable of certain arrest, self-defense skills, use of our handgun or rifle. But this is very different in these situations where we experience anxiety, and there's real physical, psychological, social threat that we
yeah.
see ourselves confronted with.
It seems like the difference between what's spoken about a lot today is about the challenge versus threat states.
Yes,
Yeah,
I think yeah, sometimes you can attach a little bit too much meaning to some of these states, but I think in principle, the appraisal that sort of lies at at the basis of these challenge and threat states is something very real. It's not always something that we deliberately engage in. Oftentimes, especially when there's little time available, it's a very quick and implicit sort of perception, almost immediate perception. Yeah, that triggers an emotional state, and the subsequent emotional state, anxiety, for instance, really impacts our behavior.
This is a little bit off topic, maybe, but you mentioned it, so that there is a lot of talk about challenge versus threat states, and there's a lot of talk about developing challenge states in police officers. Even more, there is a lot of talk about what is called the stress mindset from Dr. Ali Crum from Stanford. She did a lot of research. I'm not sure if you know her, but she did a lot of research about mindsets, the importance of mindsets, and you can have mindsets for all kinds of things, but also a stress mindset. It's very well documented. But I heard a lot of talk about seeing this as an opportunity to train officers. So to train a challenge mindset, to train a stress mindset. But it seemed like a sentence before you little bit nuanced this thinking. Is it true?
My only nuance would be that there's a lot of literature claiming that specific physiological responses are tied to the psychological appraisal. I don't think the evidence around that is always 100% solid or equivocal. But yes, you can train people, or you can use psychological strategies to move people from a threat state to a challenge state. Or a lot of this has to do with, still again, with perceptions of demands and resources, and in that sense with confidence focused strategies. So self-talk, talking yourself into a state where you perceive yourself capable of dealing with these demands that you see yourself faced with have been shown to be effective, I think.
Yeah. Well, okay. We come into the anxiety and performance later on. One more question. Also,
Sure.
there is, as you have seen maybe in recent literature and police training, there is a lot of talk about the ecological dynamical approach and constraint-led approach. Even to the point where the traditional informational processing approach is called traditional or not useful. And I'm not sure about this, but it seems like to me that there should be a middle path, so to speak. I'm not sure if ecological dynamics is that the only model for motor learning, or are there other? What is your?
No, I don't think so, Erik. Look, it's two different things in a way, although they're related. The constraint-led approach and ecological dynamics in a broader sense of the word. I think a lot of the science these days has moved from a traditional sort of informational approach to what we now call embodied, which is associated, I think, with ecological dynamics. So meaning to say that how we perceive the world around us is very much dependent on our capability to interact with our environments, right? So people with different skill sets in terms of operating in a certain situation perceive that situation differently for reason of their different skills. Constraint-led approach, I think I would probably call myself a strong believer in the constraint-led approach to motor learning. And I think it's really important to also consider psychological constraints in training motor skills, especially for people like police officers who have to use their motor skills in emotion-provoking situations, right? Just like how I don't know, a Formula One driver would need to train their skills driving in rain or whatever different sort of weather circumstances, for instance, or different cars, different setups of your car, a police officer would need to train, or anyone performing in emotion-provoking circumstances would need to train under the circumstances that are likely to emerge, or that potentially can emerge, during real-life performance.
What does the embodied approach mean? I heard Van Hutte talks about it a lot. There is a researcher called Raab, R-A-A-B.
Yes, I'm very familiar with Marcus Raab.
And I talked about Lisa Feldman Barrett's emotion research, and she even has the quote in the TED Talk about you see. I'm not sure that you see what you feel. But anyway, she talks about that
100%.
that the body has a voice in decision making. If you are standing there in the real world, it's different than
Yes.
watching it. Because you explicitly stated the embodied approach. What is the embodied approach?
I think the embodied approach to perception, for instance, would accept that there is not such a thing, at least not in how we can as humans perceive it, such a thing as objective truth, right? So a lot of our interactions with the environment are based on some perception of distance to a target, these sort of things, objective properties of the environment, but properties which, depending on our capability to interact with that environment, might not, to us as subjective observers, come across as such, right? So people, for instance, who have a fear of height tend to perceive the same height as being higher than people who don't have this fear of heights. I think one thing that we've shown, for instance, in the work that we've done with police officers, is that people who are more anxious at the same objective distance to a suspect perceive that suspect to be more threatening than somebody who is not anxious, right? So it's the account, the hypothesis, or the perspective, I should probably say, that it is not possible to separate one's psychophysiological state, one's emotional state, from how we perceive the world around us.
This seems to me a real, how do you say it? Because you can look at an officer, you can even collect data, zoals my colleague Jaap Timmer does. You can watch videos about police performance and so on, but you cannot feel what they feel, and you cannot, because you cannot take into account how their how do you call it, their experience, their what
Yes.
you're,
And this is crucial in considering police officer performance, say in court cases, as well, whatever evaluations take place, and this is something that is very, very difficult to accept, that there is a certain subjectivity in what that person would have perceived, and that often the best you can do is speak in terms of likelihoods, that given the presence of certain things that could be perceived as threats, that this person was in an anxious state, and hence could have perceived the situation different from what was objectively the case, which is often, of course, what needs and is expected to be reported. When officers complete reports about their actions.
I had a conversation with Dr. Laura Keesman. She's, I think, from the UvA, and she did a, how do you call it, qualitative research, and she really asked police officers about the perception, about etc. It's fascinating, fascinating topic.
Yes.
So these were the warming up questions.
Okay.
Now let's move on to the relation between stress, anxiety, and performance.
Sure.
Yeah, please choose what term you use, stress anxiety. And maybe because you did a dissertation, you did a lot of research. What I'm curious about is what is the broad picture? What is the broad relationship between anxiety and performance? And is there a optimal model to explain this? I know you developed a multi-level model, maybe that's the model. But what is the relationship? What did you found in the research about stress, anxiety, and performance? And what is a model to explain this?
Yeah. Well, I think it would perhaps be silly not to take my own model as an example, but because I felt certainly at the time that we published it, it reflected a few important insights that perhaps were lacking in the literature. One being sort of accepting that. So when we are in an anxious state, so let's get clear that this is already beyond that point where we make that initial appraisal, right? Like there's a difficult task that we need to achieve. There is certain dependencies. It's important for us to do well, and we are in this situation where we seriously worry about whether we can bring that situation to a good end, right?
Yeah.
Perceived demands potentially outweigh our own resources, our own capacity to bring that situation to a good end in that moment. So this is when we feel anxiety. But an important learning being, or insight being, that really the cascade of responses that is triggered by anxiety at the level of the brain, lower cognitive functions such as where we direct our attention in response to that emotion, how we process and interpret information that is available to us, that becomes available to us, linking again to that embodied perspective that we were just speaking about, but also because we're speaking often about motor behavior, so our ability to control movement, right, effectively operate in the environment, not just make decisions in our minds, but enact them as well. The physiological responses that accompany sudden increases in anxiety, and how those can dramatically alter our ability to execute skilled movement. So yes, really for that reason, a multi-level effect. That's one insight. And perhaps we come to speak about what effects at these different levels might look like. But also a second insight, I think, is that, and I think we sort of touched on it already, but that performance breakdowns, when people experience anxiety, aren't just specific to the execution phase of performance, right? Not how well somebody executes a certain arrest skill or whatever skill that they practice, but that anxiety, through its effects on these different levels, can impact the action possibilities that we perceive in a certain environment. Really, we just spoke about how different people with different feeling states and different skill sets perceive the world differently. So when we're anxious, it impacts our perceived capability to act. So hence it impacts what action possibilities we perceive in the environment. How anxiety can also impact the way in which we make decisions, and what action opportunities we tend to favor over others. Often we tend to make decisions in what I like to call a threat related manner, choosing the option that negates the aversive consequence that we see ourselves confronted with over other options that are perhaps more goal directed. Had you looked at this situation objectively, right? So impacts of anxiety on perception, selection, and execution of action opportunities, rather than execution alone. So I think that's the two most important insights.
I found it fascinating when you first published it. It looked to me like the old OODA loop, which is around in the military. And do you know the OODA loop cycle?
No.
It's observe, orient, decide, and act. It's one of
Yes.
the major. It was developed by John Boyd, a fighter pilot,
Mm.
and it came into the military and also in the old school police. And it's
Mm.
exactly. You have the first phase is situation awareness, is perception.
Yes.
Then you have the decision making phase, including interpretation. Then you have the what you call the behavior level. That's the action. So this was
Yeah.
fascinating for me. But okay, so if I'm correct, if an officer is anxious, his perception can change, his interpretation of what he see can change. Then he and in the decision making process, there are other options than when you're in another state, and then you have the actual behavior. Is that correct?
Yes.
Do you have an example of this? What where did you from one of your studies?
Look, what I could speak about studies, but what I often teach in my classes.
Mhm.
So I've in the past few years taught people who have a background in motor control and motor learning, and I teach psychologists. Often they're in the same sort of classes, but I tend to still use this image of that I found somewhere of a Dutch police officer um, being confronted with a very agitated member of the public, and in the photo, you see the member of the public looking angry and pointing at the officer. A very close interpersonal distance, very intimidating, and you see the officer holding their baton. And you can literally see the force with which they are holding that baton. Now, I use that image to communicate how in a normal situation, or maybe normal is not the right word, in a non-anxious state, potentially that officer needs to focus on quite a few different things, attend to quite a few different things in that particular situation. But in an anxious state, most, if not all, of the attention would go to the potential threat that they perceive. So that particular person is sort of zoomed in on, the rest fades to the background. And the only thing you can think of is what is he going to do and how am I going to respond, right? So that's the level of perception. Then at the level of selection or decision making, in any situation, there is a range of things that we can potentially do, right? In confrontation with an agitated member of the public, there's different things we can do. We can, I don't know, continue conversation, try to de-escalate, which perhaps is the favorable option. We could use physical force because we're holding that baton. Maybe that's something that this particular officer was already unintendedly moving ahead with. We don't know. Another thing you could do is, if you really don't see this coming to a good end, make sure you get the hell out of there. And maybe there's other things, like we don't know, right? As you said, we can't look inside the heads of police officers in these situations. In an anxious state, assuming that the officer would interpret the behavior of the member of the public as threatening, potentially moving towards physical violence, you can already see that this is linked with a different behavioral response being selected as compared to when the officer would not be anxious and simply interprets the behavior of the member of the public as yeah, they're asking for attention, they want me to take them seriously, and so I should take them seriously, but I should, like, you know, I should pitch my tone of voice, and I should think about how I address this person to make sure that I appropriately de-escalate. So different selection, and then of course in terms of the action execution, say that this person would move forward with using physical violence, given their anxious state. You can see the tension in their body with anxious states. What happens is that excitation along the corticospinal tract is increased, so it's easier for motor commands to be translated into muscle activity, which is very useful from an evolutionary perspective. We're very capable of responding real quick to whatever threat we perceive. But it also means that in situations like this, if we do have that physiological response, we can potentially use excessive force. Or in case of more in case of more intricate movements being required, that we become more rigid rather than fluent, more abrupt rather than fluent in how we execute skilled movement. So lowering the quality of our execution. Yeah, I don't know if that comes across. I of course see this image of that I
Yeah, it
use
comes across.
in
Yeah,
in my lectures quite vividly. But this is something that I use, and I think that's why I use this example rather than something that comes directly from our research, because in research we've changed situations and scenarios that we investigated specifically for reason of the question that we were addressing, and it's very seldom that everything comes together, of course,
yeah.
in one particular situation.
So now, and if you look at from a, how do you call it, a ketting,
Chain?
ketting. If you look at from a chain, in for example, in some kinds of psychotherapy, we use chain analysis, where to intervene. So you have the perception, you have the selection, you have the behavior. Where are intervening points in, for example, in training or maybe the officer self? Is it when the
Yeah.
perception is influenced by anxiety, is the chain going how anyway?
Yeah, I think coming back to the model again, I think it specifies a couple of ways in which you can mitigate negative effects of anxiety on your performances. But yes, in situations where there is time, of course you can work to regulate your emotional response, right? So this is something like you might have spoken with other people about arousal regulation strategies, regulation strategies, to move more towards like this physical state where we can sort of keep behaving in a goal-directed manner despite the anxiety or the stressful nature of the circumstances. I should probably say. At the same time, there's many situations that officers see themselves confronted with that are characterized by there not being this time to sort of take a couple deep breaths and regulating your emotions. In those cases, I think to a large extent, there's a little bit that you can do in terms of self-talk, thought-stopping techniques, mental strategies, to direct your attention to things that you know from your training are task relevant rather than stimulus driven,
Yeah.
given by emotion in those circumstances, and that you need to attend to in order to bring the situation to a good end. But I think to a large extent, what it comes down to is training and giving yourself the opportunity to practice each of those skills in the assessment of the situation, the decision making, but
Yeah,
also in the
great.
execution. So don't just focus on the execution, also on
Great.
the assessment of the situation, your decision making, and your execution, to practice those situations with accompanying emotion,
Yeah.
as long as it's safe, during training.
It's a great point. Recently there came a dissertation out of Finland from a police officer doing his PhD together with Paolo Di Nota and Judith Anderson, and he exactly this did. His dissertation is about situational awareness and making it very concrete and doing really the research, and exactly to your point, because the action phase is well trained, well, how do you call it? Has a lot of attention, but what goes before?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And you also talked about goal-directed and stimulus-driven behavior. I have to admit, I have really overlooked that for a long time. I read it in your studies 10 years or more ago and so on, but it didn't catch me right then. But it seems to me very important. Can you explain this, and what does this mean for training?
Mm, mm. Where to start? So I think normally, and this includes motor behaviors, so executing skilled movement, but normally we we require a certain degree of online control in order to produce skilled movement, and there's regions in the brain that communicate with each other in order to make deliberate, goal-directed decisions, execute goal-directed actions. And then under the influence of emotion that we experience in the moment, so this anxiety that might kick in stressful circumstances, this network of brain regions that we need for goal-directed action is sort of actively shut down. And another sort of network of brain regions kicks in, which, as I mentioned previously, sort of facilitates really quick, really fast responding to whatever salient, emotionally relevant information that we perceive without any cognitive intervention, right? This would only slow us down. When we, like from an evolutionary perspective, if we're confronted with a sudden threat, we don't want to lose time thinking and deliberating what would potentially be the best course of action, right? So it's really this emotional brain that kicks in this moment that we show this anxiety response, and it shuts down our ability to behave in a goal-directed manner. Now, although from an evolutionary perspective, that makes sense for people like police officers, but also think about other professionals working in very stressful circumstances, surgeons, first responders, think about the military. These are people that work in very stressful circumstances, but in context or in the process of achieving their task objectives may experience stress, psychological stress, physical stress, and to the extent that their anxiety response in those situations draws attention away from where it should be, in terms of bringing that situation to a good end, staying goal directed, moving towards more threat related information, this can be a huge distraction. So yes, the challenge for these people, we shouldn't blame them for having a very normal human stress response. The challenge for these people is to, in this situation where you're sort of pulled to behave in a what we then call a stimulus driven manner, in an emotional manner, to remain sufficiently goal directed to maintain your performance.
Yeah, we will go into this, but for me personally, are we talking about the salience network? What do you have, the executive?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, and you can see it on fMRIs, or it's really...
You would need to use fMRI. So this is one of the problems, right? In looking back at sort of real life situations, and was the officer under a lot of stress and so forth, and was the stress sufficient, was the anxiety response sufficient to explain why they behaved in a certain manner, made choices in a certain manner. We cannot see this from the outside.
No.
We need to put people in a scanner in order to see coherence in activity between different brain regions, and yes, whether this corresponds to what we call a task or an executive network versus which is typical of a stress response, the salience network that would then kick in and take over.
Okay, now we come into another topic which is called response inhibition, suppression. I feel like this because I think I've also personally experienced that I'm going to react a little bit stimulus driven, and I want to stay. I don't know if suppressing is the right word, but you can feel it. You're trying to behave in a way which is not goal directed. Does response inhibition, and I'm not sure if this is the term you use, response inhibition, is the relationship with this goal-directed behavior? Or is this a different topic?
No, fair point. Like, well, we can segue into this
Yeah.
into this topic quite easily. Response inhibition is a cognitive function that we use to, I think, manage our behavior in more dynamic situations, right? There's a lot of situations in real life, including the work of police officers, where we set out to engage in certain actions or responses, but then the situation changes and we need to cancel an action because it is no longer appropriate, or we need to change an action because something else is the more appropriate response at that moment. Now, what we've done with police officers, and this is really how I sort of ended up in the field of response inhibition, also with my research, because response inhibition is something that I still do a lot of work with, is looking at shooting decisions of police officers. So police officers' ability to adequately respond in, of course, in research, very simple shoot, don't shoot scenarios, and where we observed that when police officers were anxious, they were more likely, more inclined to respond, increased action tendency, but at the cost of making more shooting related errors, right? So anxiety made police officers more inclined to respond with shooting. Now, later research that we done showed that there is an association between shooting errors and people's ability to inhibit responses. And it's something really that I first became interested in because I always spoke, of course, with police officers in the research that we did. And often, and perhaps this is something you recognize, there were situations where people sort of were aware, police officers were aware of themselves responding inappropriately. So sort of in the process of pulling the trigger, our research was to do with handgun shooting behavior. In the process of pulling the trigger, having some awareness that, but I'm shooting at someone who doesn't have a handgun, but has a phone or has empty hands, and I should withhold that response, but finding yourself, frustratingly so, incapable of stopping the action that you already started. And so yes, in later research we were able to, not just by word of the police officers in question, but also quantitatively with data, show that with anxiety, because we're more inclined to respond, more inclined to act, which again comes back to that evolutionary response of being able to very quickly respond to not just actual but also potential danger that we perceive, that we need a little bit more time to effectively execute and inhibit our response. So stop responses, right? We're more geared to act and less geared to stop and withhold.
Yeah.
And that this explains part of the shooting errors that we see. Yeah, so at the moment we're looking at this in a lot more detail, also at the level of the brain, and how not just anxious states and seeing people confronted with threats, how that impacts our ability to withhold responses, so how that impacts response inhibition, but also, for instance, how sleep and a lack of sleep potentially puts people at greater risk of responding in an emotional manner in those situations.
Can you learn inhibition? It's a bad sentence, but can you learn to can you learn inhibition? Yeah.
Yes. Well, the answer is yes, you can. So there's individual differences between people, as there is with many things, in terms of our ability to withhold responses. But it is also a trainable skill to an extent. We tried that a little bit with police officers back in the day, along similar lines as how we had officers train sort of their handgun shooting performance, so just the shot execution, in anxious and non-anxious states, and seeing that people can learn to shoot more accurately in stressful situations if they practice their shooting in anxious states, so training with anxiety. We also tried to copy paste that onto a situation where people had to learn and inhibit shooting responses in those situations where it was inappropriate, and still engage in a timely and accurate execution of shooting in those situations where it was appropriate. It's not as easily trained because there's more cognitive involvement, and I said that is something that is really difficult when people feel anxious. So in that sense, it's still an open-ended question. We know from more basic research, less to do with skilled movement behavior than with simple computer-based tasks, which are often used in research, that in the end, provided you have enough time and enough repetitions to train, and that this is something that can be trained. There is some, but this is more at the level of brain physiology. There's some things in terms of supplements and that you could think of, availability of neurotransmitters, inhibitors, that potentially have an effect as well. Yeah, but the problem is, focusing on the behavioral intervention, the problem is finding the time and the resources to get that done effectively.
Do you think is this topic of response inhibition, is this an important topic for police trainers and police researchers to, and does it have some potential applications in the end?
Yeah, I think it's very early days. There's even some examples of how sort of training your executive functions, your cognitive functions, that response inhibition is a part of. So being able to direct attention to where you know it should be, and being able to inhibit attending to information or responding to information that you shouldn't attend to or shouldn't respond to, and that training these executive functions can potentially make for some positive effect on operational performance as well. As said, repetitions are important, time is important, and potentially this is something where VR can play an important role, something where it's more easy to generate lots of repetitions, make quick adjustments in scenarios that you can sort of shape people's responses. But I think it's very, very early days, and yeah, in that sense, I think the given the time that officers have at the moment, I think probably to train, I mean, probably the value mostly sits in becoming aware of the possible responses that you might show, so more exposure, and raising some degree of awareness, than actually taking the time to shape and train this skill
It reminds me
to
of,
the level where it actually
yeah,
has effect.
it reminds me of Karen Roelofs, you know, Professor Roelofs from Radboud.
Yes.
And they developed a game called Dust. I'm not sure if you know it. It's a
I'm
VR
not
game.
familiar with the game, but I'm familiar with her general, yeah.
So they developed the immersive VR game with a shoot no shoot goal, and they measure RHV. It seems to me that their response inhibition also plays, because plays a big role when to shoot.
Absolutely, like these typical no shoot situations are not strictly speaking response inhibition task, but they look to quantify people's tendency to act or impulsivity in given scenarios. And yeah, as said, ultimately this is something that can be trained, of course, you need to think very carefully about the stimuli that you expose people to, because you want to map the response onto appropriate stimuli and withholding the response onto appropriate stimuli. And again, this is constraint-led approach to motor learning, so you need to think carefully about what whether or not you can identify what is appropriate and not appropriate across a range of possibilities. But I think a lot of where this sort of work and these VR scenarios are potentially useful is seeing how people respond, how likely people are to respond in a stimulus-driven manner, and perhaps recognizing that for those people who show strong responses, that these are the people that you might want to specifically target in terms of teaching some strategies, working on their emotion regulation skills, their self-management skills, to sort of to optimize their responding in real life situations as best as possible.
Yeah. Well, Arne, the last question, because it's evening in New Zealand. I'm just starting the day. It's about sleep, and I'm very interested in sleep. I saw you did a lot of research as first author or second author and so on sleep and performance. How do you became interested in sleep, and what did you learn that we can profit from?
Yeah, sleep is a fascinating topic. How did I become interested in? Well, of course, we do it every day. And if we do it every day, it must be something incredibly valuable. Otherwise, evolution would have made that we don't do it so often. And then, of course, this awareness that, especially in people who perform at a very high level, sleep is often something that is easily compromised. At the same time, with my exposure to the work of police officers, being very aware of how things like shift work restrict people's ability to obtain sufficient sleep or feel rested, and how this anecdotally sort of impacts your ability to perform, impacts your mood, impacts your ability to perform. So we done quite a bit of work with athletes back in the day in the Netherlands around their sleep, how sleep impacts performance of athletes, what sort of things athletes can do to optimize their sleep as much as possible. Haven't done any actual work with police officers on their sleep, but at the moment, for instance, I'm working on sort of quantifying how sleep deprived do you need to be for something like response inhibition to deteriorate, and is it so that people whose sleep is restricted because of how sleep deprivation impacts emotional responding, how sleep deprived do you need to be, or how much would people who are sleep deprived be at an extra risk of potentially showing a breakdown in inhibitory control, specifically in these stressful circumstances. So that is something we're looking at currently. What I've learned is for something like response inhibition to be impacted significantly, you need to sleep pretty bad. It isn't something that is immediately impacted with a little bit less sleep for 1 or 2 nights. What is immediately impacted is your ability to remain focused for longer periods of time, which can of course impact your functioning, cause you to miss out on certain information, and that can make for an important impact on behavior. But like as we were speaking about the withholding of responses, that is something that is pretty robust, pretty automatic, and only with total sleep deprivation, so not sleeping at all or prolonged sleep restriction over numbers of days, is that something that becomes impacted. Yeah, so then it becomes, knowing that it does have an impact in various ways, it becomes interesting to think about, wow, what can we do in terms of work schedules to make
Yeah.
sure that at least have enough sleep, that where there is sleep restriction, that it doesn't accumulate too much over a number of days. So yeah, potentially important from a work organization perspective. At the same time, sometimes when work is stressful, when performances are important, people don't use the time they're given to sleep optimally, right? People spend lots of time lying awake because they're still thinking about what happened during the day, or in anticipation of what happens the next day. So a little bit of work as well on what we can do to sort of quiet the mind and make sure that we
Can
at
can
least
you
give
can you
ourselves
give
the.
can you give just one practical example? What would be an intervention if you're lying awake, or you have bad sleep?
Yeah, well, what is difficult for police officers is regularity, but that's what you would normally start with. The body needs to get used, and the mind need to get used to certain times where it's asleep and where it's awake and active. But otherwise, what you can do is sort of physical strategies, is breathing exercises, so lowering physiological arousal. What you can do, of course, before you go to bed is whenever you find yourself sort of worked up and worried about things, is writing them down, parking them for the time being. And what is very important is that we keep sort of creating this association between our bed and being asleep and restful. So that meaning to say that in those moments where we're awake for longer periods of time, and it is not possible for us to fall asleep within, say, 20 minutes or so, don't stay in bed and don't keep trying, but get out of bed, um, and use the time there to calm yourself down, read a book, write down whatever is keeping you awake, and then when you feel tired, go back to bed again.
Are you aware of any research about the power nap? Is there any
Oh
good?
yes, yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yes.
Yeah.
Power naps can be incredibly useful, and often necessary in those cases where sort of nighttime sleep isn't sufficient
Mm.
for whatever reason. They can provide a quick boost in alertness. Yeah, I think the issue is more that a lot of work situations aren't um, really facilitating the implementing of power naps. It's not, at least not in Western society, a very accepted thing to be doing. But I think there's a lot to learn. And well, to that point, I think um, national level, international level sport was making a move, or is making a move in that direction. But to provide spaces for people to during work hours. Um,
So there is robust research, if I'm
Oh,
very,
yes. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
okay.
100%.
Mm,
100%. Yeah. Yeah.
okay. Okay. Yes, I would really like to move into the topic of mental fatigue. It was just
Ah,
published, but I think I have to be careful of your time also. But it
hmm.
also seems a very important topic. There was recently a paper I'm not sure if you know the Sportgericht magazine is one of it
Mm.
is a Dutch magazine, and
Yeah.
there were some publications from Rudens and so on. Also very.
Yes.
Did you study mental fatigue, by the way?
Yes.
Ah, okay. Okay. Um, well, I have to sit on my hands, and we do it another time. Okay. Um, did I forget to ask you important questions? Is there something you want to add?
No, look, there's so many things we could speak about. I think we covered a lot of more
Yeah.
fundamental things, and I think the different shapes and forms in which these sort of anxious responses present themselves in an operational context. I think hopefully the research speaks for itself in that regard. Yeah, and I hope that what came across also is how representative practice, and from that constraint-led approach, how introducing some of these psychological states that we see triggered in performance situations, making those part of practice, as you would with any other sort of physical constraint
Yeah.
on your performance, how that can lead to important gains. That said, I think we touched upon how tricky it can sometimes be, that you need appropriate time also to sometimes establish these positive effects. But that's a different topic.
Yeah. And for me personally, the challenge for me is with professionals who have a lot of experience in high pressure situations. It's easily said to provide them with stressful situations in training, the constraints they face but they are very difficult to trigger in this training situation because, well, yeah, even if you talk about simulation, it's not they get used to it, and
I think that's potentially one of the important applied challenges for police trainers, to identify what, in particular situations that are the topic of your training, of your operational training, what are characteristics of the environment that are perceived as stressors, as threats, and to see to what extent you can introduce those, make those part of practice, knowing that what one officer finds threatening or stressful isn't necessarily the same as what another or the next officer finds stressful or threatening. And of course, there's limits to what you can do in terms of individualizing. And of course, I think, and we showed that in our research as well, experience is an important factor. And yes, experienced officers respond with less anxiety. And look, by all means, that's a positive thing, right? In a way, and because it shows that what they've done, either in context of training or in context of what they're exposed to in real life, somehow shaped the strength or the potency of their emotional response, and has helped them hopefully to behave despite the stressful nature of the situation in a more goal-directed manner.
Because the paradox also is that the thing where police officers experience the most stress in training is with their certification.
Yes. Yeah. Annoyingly so, it's often these rules and regulations that cause more stress during practice than but look, these are things that are important to reflect on and to think about. Because it is not only, say, in practicing handgun shooting, it's not only the physical danger that people are confronted with, but and perhaps you can relate to this from what I hear from police officers, it's also the awareness of what are the consequences if I behave in an inappropriate manner. All the process and the consequences if you make an inappropriate decision, those are very much in people's awareness. So this is potentially a stressor that you can make part, like implementing consequences for making shooting errors, in addition to working, say, with something like simulation, is very helpful in practicing shooting decisions.
Do you have one last tip for police trainers, or maybe for researchers, about a very inspiring book, podcast, research article? What should we learn, watch tomorrow?
What pops to mind, other than probably watching your podcast, because I'm sure you speak with lots of interesting people, is I think it was last year or the year before with a collection, and I'll send you the link, with a collection of international police researchers. We wrote short essays. I think it was 10 or 11 essays on what we perceive to be current topics in police research and training. So not just about operational performance, but about lots of different topics. And I think that would be a good introduction to see what sort of sparks your interest. What is it that you're currently working on yourself, and that you'd like to know a little bit more about, and what the science is behind it. So I'll send you that link, and maybe that's a nice introduction to some new discoveries.
I will put it in the show notes, Arne. So thank you so much. I will I will end this session, and then I have to want to say goodbye to you personally.
Oh.
For now, thank you so much, and I hope everybody got a lot of knowledge and inspiration from this conversation. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks for